I've made the 100 episode Let's Play, I've made the in-depth guides, I've talked to the community at length about their experience with the game, I've completed everything in the game and gotten the Platinum Trophy, and now it is finally time to just sit down and talk about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I'm going to be talking about a lot of spoilers during this review, but I will let you know when I'm talking about the ending of the game. Alright, let's just get right into it. So first I want to talk about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as a remake, as the second part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake series. Now, Final Fantasy VII Remake did a really good job of taking all of these scenes we know and love from Final Fantasy VII and either just showing them to us in a modern way or changing them in a way that keeps it fresh and interesting. Where the Final Fantasy VII Remake really struggled was its ending. They got a little bit too invested in this crazy story they were trying to tell, and they kind of lost sight of the main themes and ideas of the original Final Fantasy VII. I'm happy to say that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth really feels like they dialed that back a little bit and tried to focus more heavily on the main themes of the original Final Fantasy VII. One of the biggest outcries about the remake were the whispers and how they felt like they were invested into every single scene when they really didn't need to be. In Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the whispers are way more toned down. They seem to only be around when they actually need to be for storytelling and not just inserted into every single scene they possibly can be. For example, when we get to something like the Red 13 scene in Cosmo Canyon, the whispers aren't randomly inserted into the scene to talk about how this is how it was in the original, but now fate has changed, etc., etc. That scene is just allowed to be that scene. Now, the whispers are still around, but they're in the scenes that are telling the general narrative of the trilogy of the remake, and not just inserted into every single scene that is a reference to some material from the original. Now, in general, when it comes to changes and stuff, I feel the same way that I did with Remake. Almost every change in this game is either to enhance the original scene or to make it work in a modern setting. Other than that, they did an amazing job celebrating the original game. There are so many scenes in this game that feel like they would have been in the original game had that game not been on the PS1 and made in a little over a year. There are so many scenes that feel specifically like love letters to the fans, or changes that are there to throw the original fans off and give them a new experience. There are even some deep cut references that are incredible to experience on a first playthrough. Now, are all the changes perfect? Of course not. In fact, there's one scene in particular that I'll talk about during the story section that I really feel like missed the mark in terms of conveying those original emotions and themes that were in the original. But in general, when playing through the game, it really does feel like a celebration of the original. It has all these new ideas that keeps things fresh, but also takes into account the original, and overall just makes for an awesome mix, and I feel like they did it better in this game than they did in Remake. When this game was being developed and I was listening to all of the discourse around the internet about what people wanted the game to be, there was one specific thing that felt like it came up more than anything else. This feeling of wanting the game to be an open world. Everybody wanted to experience that moment when you first walk out of Midgar in the original game and realize that there's a big, vast open world for you to explore. Now, a lot of that was for gameplay reasons. We didn't want all three games to just be a linear mission progression because over the course of 3 huge games, that would get really, really tiring. But I do feel like the general consensus around the community was that not only did we want an open game just because it would be more fun, but specifically for that feeling of leaving Midgar. We needed this game to feel like the world map, whatever that meant, either being an open world or being open zone, or literally having like a world map. Whatever that was, we needed that in this game. And I tell you what, man, they nailed it. The game keeps you on rails for a little bit with the Nibelheim flashback in the calm section, but then hits you with this huge open area to explore. It is genuinely mesmerizing to have all of these tools that we had during Remake, but in this open setting where we can just explore and experiment. It genuinely did its best to give me that same feeling I had when I left Midgar in the original game. From all of the different communities that I had talked to during the development of this game, it felt like that was the feeling that people wanted the most. And I really do feel like this game hit the mark. And it doesn't just end there. The expansiveness of this world continues to grow as you play, And that moment that you get in the tiny Bronco and realize that everything is connected and you can just take the tiny Bronco wherever you want to go and explore without any load screens, that was incredible. So overall, I feel like this game is an even better showing of what a Final Fantasy VII Remake can be. I think the Final Fantasy VII Remake took it a bit too far at times, but mostly kept on track, whereas Rebirth kept on track almost the entire game, with only a few moments you can look at and think, maybe they went a bit too far with this. In the original Final Fantasy VII, Midgar is really iconic, but I think that the expansiveness of the entire world is what really captured our hearts back on the PS1, and I think that Rebirth does such a great job capturing that feeling. The story of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a really well-paced and entertaining ride all the way through. During my first playthrough, I was genuinely never bored. There was always something going on, always some kind of stakes, always some kind of character interaction that we were looking to have some kind of resolution to, and always something to explore. They found a way to make every single section of this game entertaining, even if it was kind of a downtime in the original. A lot of the smaller moments from the original game, like the cargo ship or the Junon infiltration, have turned into massive chapters with a ton of character interaction and a lot of foreshadowing to events in the future. Now, of course, there are a lot of changes to the original story, but I feel like in this game they did an even better job of making sure that all of these changes fell in line with what the original developers had in mind, or just fit what a modern game should look like, or be some kind of curveball to throw all of the old fans for a loop. Now, of course, there are some blunders. There are some scenes that people felt like didn't fit the original narrative, but overall, when I finished the game, I felt like this was Final Fantasy VII. I remember there was a moment when I finished Final Fantasy VII Remake where I had to really sit and think to myself, is this Final Fantasy VII, or did they go a bit too far? In Rebirth, I didn't feel that way at all. I felt like there were some scenes that I didn't like or felt like the changes were a bit off, but overall when I finished the game, I felt like I had just played a remake of Final Fantasy VII. One of the scenes that people had a specific issue with was the Barret and Dyne scene. Some people felt that the way that Dyne's story concluded didn't really fit with the original, and some people thought that the fight with Palmer halfway through the scene really threw off all of the emotions. Now, I really liked the Barret and Dyne scene. I felt like the way that the entire thing was handled was really great, and I was connected to it the entire time. But I do understand this complaint, and I think that the emotional weight of Dyne's death just wasn't the same as it was in the original because of the way they changed it. Now, I personally really liked the Palmer section. Something that the original game does a lot is it'll raise the stakes up to a point and then it'll shift to something else entirely and make you think about those stakes the entire time and then bring it back for a conclusion. And that's pretty much exactly what the Palmer section does. It is a bit of a whiplash to have such an emotional moment and then have such a goofy scene with Palmer, but that's kind of quintessential Final Fantasy VII. The original game loves to rip control from you right when you want to know the conclusion to something and let you stew in it for a bit before revealing what actually happened. But I can agree that maybe the Barret Dyne section was just a bit too emotional to try to pull something like this off. Either way, I did love the finale of this scene, and after the Palmer section, it does allow the scene to breathe a bit and give Barret his moment. Speaking of letting scenes breathe, the Red 13 section. This section was amazing. They took the original scene almost beat by beat and hit everything to perfection. Seto's theme playing in the background is absolutely tear-jerking. It is so good. But then they nearly ruin it by not giving it any time to breathe and bringing G Nataka in to talk almost the exact moment the scene is supposed to end. There are times when you can have a big emotional scene like this and have something cut through the tension, but that's just not how the original does it at all. This feels so disingenuous to the original game, which had such an amazing fade out here and allowed you to just sit and feel the emotions. And for what? Just to have Gina talk a bit quicker? There was no reason why we couldn't have a fade out here and be able to sit and feel the emotions a bit, and then have the characters starting to walk out and have Gina jump out and talk to them. There are changes in this game that deviate from the original, but they all feel like they have purpose. This one doesn't feel like it has purpose at all. Just allow the scene to breathe a little bit and then have Gina talk jump out. Now I want to talk about the ending a bit, so if you want to skip ending spoilers, go to this time. Got it? Alright. So before I talk about the very last part of the game, let's talk about the Temple of the Ancients. The scene where each party member goes to their individual door and has their individual trials. This scene was probably my favorite in the game. Because this is such a long experience stretched out over 3 massive games, it's easy to lose sight of each individual character in the story. Now it does feel like they did a pretty good job giving each character their moments throughout the game, with the exception of Aerith, which I'll talk about in a minute. But this section here was so genius because it really brings us all back to what's really important, the characters on the journey. We get a glimpse into why every character is fighting, why all of this matters, why it's not just a journey to defeat Sephiroth, but each individual character has a reason for being here. It's easy to lose sight of Final Fantasy during all of this. There's so many things going on in this game and so many big ideas and so many bombastic scenes. This really brings me back to the core of Final Fantasy. This moment right here takes me out of the overproduced, over-budgeted AAA extravaganza and puts me back into original Final Fantasy. I've seen some arguments online about how a lot of the scenes of this game are overdone in a way, like the Midgar Zolom scene where instead of it just being like, did Sephiroth do this? Instead, it's this huge crazy thing where Sephiroth comes in and Cloud's drowning, and it just all feels like a bit overdone at times, and they couldn't just have the original scene and the original emotions that that scene should convey. But here's a moment that doesn't even happen in the original at all, but it feels like it fits so well. When it was first announced that the Temple of the Ancients was going to be in Rebirth, I was begging for the temple to be completely different from the original. Yes, I did want Rebirth to hit all of those original moments that we know and love from the original. Barrett and Dine, Red 13, the Nibelheim flashback. But there were so many moments that I knew could be done better. For example, the Gongaga reactor, which is basically nothing in the original. But here they made it into this entire section with the Shinra and Cisne and stuff. And even more so than that, the Temple of the Ancients. The Temple of the Ancients did have great story moments in the original, but it was ripe to be added to. It had so much potential going into Rebirth, and when I found out that it was basically the big climax of the game, I was so stoked. And I tell you what, man, they delivered. Like I said, this scene, you could pick it up and put it in the original, and it would completely fit. But it also fits for Rebirth and what it needs to do, because like I said, it needs to remind us of why these characters are on the journey because of how long this journey is now. So that scene is probably my favorite in the game. But now let's talk about my least favorite. Now I said that I had gripes about Remake's ending. In the end, I did like Remake's ending, but I do feel like if there's anything to complain about with Remake, that's probably the biggest thing, is how the ending went a bit too crazy, bit too overboard, didn't really hit the themes of Midgar in the original, and just kind of went off on its own tangent. Now I think that Rebirth's ending in general is really good. It hit a lot of the stuff that it needed to hit, it was really epic and entertaining, and it leaves us with a ton of questions for part 3, which was probably the most important thing for it to do. The problem with Rebirth's ending is Aerith. Aerith is, in a lot of ways, the most important character of Final Fantasy VII. One of the first concepts of Final Fantasy VII was a love triangle between the protagonist and 2 side characters. This turned into one of the core themes of the game, which is Aerith starting as a part of the love triangle of Cloud and Tifa, and then ending up realizing her true goal and her true mission was to be a martyr for the planet. This theme is expressed many times throughout the game, whether it be the iconic scene with Cloud and Aerith in the playground, the iconic date scene, the list goes on. We as the player are supposed to be genuinely confused as to where this love triangle is going and learn alongside with Aerith what her path is actually supposed to be. My biggest problem with Rebirth as a whole is the fact that it loses sight of this theme quite a bit. In fact, Aerith kind of completely falls off as a character. They focus a lot in this game on Cloud and Tifa's relationship, which I think is a good thing. In Remake, they focused on it a lot more because they needed more character interaction, because Midgar doesn't really have much character interaction in the original game, given that it's only a few hours long, so they added a lot of little tensions between Cloud and Tifa, which then pay off in Rebirth. That all makes sense. The problem is, Aerith is just completely gone out of the picture. She does next to nothing throughout the entire game. In fact, the only memorable scene with Aerith before the finale is her with Zack's parents in Gungaga. All of the rest of her scenes are basically just her being goofy or her being best friends with Tifa. I do like how they exaggerated Tifa and Aerith's friendship. In the original, they show it off a little bit, but there just isn't really enough there to really grasp it. In Remake, they really exaggerate it, and there's all these goofy moments where they're cracking jokes or making fun of Cloud or whatever. But this ends up backfiring a bit because she's just kind of a goof character all the way until the end, and it's a bit hard to take her seriously. It's hard to feel the weight of Cloud and Aerith's relationship when we get to the death scene, because mostly he's just been talking to Tifa the entire game. In the original, Aerith's date scene was the most common one. That was done on purpose. You had to go a bit out of your way to get the other dates. Most of the time in your casual playthrough, you would be getting Aerith's date. But regardless of the date scene, even if you didn't get the Aerith date scene on your first playthrough, there are a lot of scenes that show that Cloud truly cares about Aerith and is genuinely confused between Aerith and Tifa. In Rebirth, it is very obvious that he is fighting his feelings for Tifa, and there's really not much going on with Aerith. Now, there are a lot of reasons that you could point to as to why this change happened. Probably the biggest one is the fact that Zack has a bigger role in the game, so it just makes sense for Cloud not to be going so hard for Aerith. But the point of all of this is, regardless of whether or not you think that's a good change or not, it has horrible implications for the finale of Rebirth. Now, I do want to start off by saying, I absolutely love what they did with the death scene. It cannot be understated how amazing it was to feel the death scene for the first time again. Going into the creation of this game, Square Enix knew that the Aerith death scene was going to be the finale, and they needed to find a way to make us care about that. The Aerith death scene is one of the most iconic death scenes in gaming. Even if you've never played the original, there's a good chance you know what happens in the death scene. We have been talking about it and analyzing it for decades, so how do we make this scene relevant again? How do we make people care about it? The solution to this was genius. Basically, they just make us think that we don't know the answer. By putting a lot of hints in their advertising as to whether or not Aerith actually will die in the finale, we all got to experience the death scene for the first time again. I was not spoiled at all to the finale of Rebirth, so when I got to the final scene, I genuinely didn't know if Aerith was going to die or not. I can't tell you how amazing that is. I've known the Aerith death scene since I was a kid, since I first experienced it as a kid and was blown away by the death of this character. I never thought I would be able to feel that again. But here we are. I genuinely watched that scene not knowing what was going to happen, and that's such a cool moment. And I have to say that in the moment, I did really enjoy it, but looking back on it now, there's a huge problem. Even though we didn't know if Aerith was going to die or not, they made it so difficult to actually feel the emotion of her death. What I felt in the moment was shock. Like, oh, they actually did follow the script. They really did kill Aerith. But what I didn't feel was very much sadness for the moment. There is a laundry list of things that they did in this scene to take away a lot of the emotion and make it kind of feel hollow. First of all, right before this is the Temple of the Ancients scene we talked about earlier, and in those trials we see a lot of people die in the pasts of these characters. Now, just because other people have died doesn't mean we can't be sad about Aerith's death, but it does take away a lot of the emotional weight of losing a character when you just saw a bunch of other characters lose their lives. Then there's the fake out where it looks like Sephiroth missed, but then you see the blood and realize that he didn't miss. Then we have the big boss fight afterwards, which, to be fair, there wasn't a lot they could really do here. They do have the Aerith theme playing during the beginning of the boss, just like in the original, but then you go off and fight 30 more bosses, and you don't really get that moment right after the Genova fight where you see Aerith laying there dead and all the characters react. Then you have all the craziness going on with Cloud's mind, and it doesn't even seem like he thinks that Aerith is dead, and so throughout all these boss battles, you're not really sure if she's dead, so you never really get to feel the weight of the moment, never get to feel the sadness come over you. You're just waiting to see what happens next. Then we have the final boss fight where Aerith does come back, and now we have a question of, is this the Aerith that died? Is this not the Aerith that died? Is it two Aeriths? Is it just her spirit? What's going on here? We don't know. We gotta fight Sephiroth. In the original, there's so many things that build up to the emotional weight of Aerith's death, one of which being losing her as a character. You just got her ultimate weapon in the Temple of the Ancients, and you can see the power of the character. And as soon as she leaves, that's it. She's gone. You never get to use her again. You never get to use that really cool ultimate weapon again. You never get to have your dedicated magic caster again. She is gone. But with Rebirth, the second that she's gone, few bosses later, you're using her again in a fight. There's also the lack of the lake scene, which a lot of people were frustrated with. I understand why it's not there because we're setting up the third game, but gotta say, it takes a lot of the emotion out of her death when we don't get to actually see Cloud place her in the lake and get kind of the finality of the moment of, yes, she is gone. So all of this boils down to, we don't get to feel the sadness that we felt in the original game when Aerith passes, which isn't the end of the world, but I do feel like that is a core theme of Final Fantasy VII. We build up this character interaction between Cloud and Aerith throughout the entire game. We don't know exactly what's going on with the love triangle. We don't know what's going on with Zack. We don't know what's going to happen with Aerith. And then suddenly she's ripped away from us. And we have to feel that. We have to feel the sadness of not having her as a character. We have to feel the sadness of Cloud and how he says, never again will she feel, never again will she talk, etc., etc. We don't get to feel that here, and that is a real shame. That is such a huge core value of the original game that's totally lost. Now, do I blame the game completely here? No, not really. There's not a ton they could have done. We've all already felt that sadness before. I do feel like the way that they set it up, is she really gonna die? And then we get there and she does die. There was an opportunity there to have us feel that sadness all over again. But because of all the goofiness they do in the scene with, is she really dead, the fake out, Cloud's mind, all that stuff, it's just all lost. I feel like there was a way that they could have had it both ways. They could have had us feel the sadness over Aerith's death, let that scene cook a little bit, and then at the very end been like, wait, is she actually really dead? Now, having said all of that, I am still very, very happy with the way that the original game was treated in Rebirth. And I feel like the story in general was very well paced, very entertaining all the way through, and leaves a lot of questions that is going to make it very interesting to talk about over the next couple of years while we wait for the third game. Now let's talk about the gameplay. The game throws you in head first with a lot of the mechanics that you've already learned in Remake. The game then stacks on top of that all of the synergy abilities and new concepts that Rebirth has to offer, and basically gives you the entire toolbox right off the bat. At first I was skeptical of this. It felt like they needed to do a better job of teaching us stuff over time instead of just throwing everything at us at once. But honestly, looking back, I kind of like the way they did this. They give us everything right away and then give us the open world to just go out and explore and experiment with stuff and learn it all at our own pace. It doesn't feel like you need to use any of these concepts to beat any of the early bosses, so even though it throws everything at you right away, it gives you a lot of breathing room to slowly learn at your own pace and master the new abilities before you actually need to use them. When I played the open world demo before the game came out, I was really worried that there was just too much going on. The menus were too over encumbered and there was too many things that I could do in any scenario that it felt like I was just gonna stick to one thing that worked well and not actually experiment with everything. And to be honest, I continued to feel this way all the way up until Cosmo Canyon when I was playing the game normally. It felt like the synergy abilities were cool, but I had so many other abilities to use that worked just as well that I didn't want to go out of my way to learn all these new concepts. But when I got to the Bahamut boss fight, something clicked. I was using the synergy attacks because you have to pressure him, and I was using the synergy abilities so that I could get infinite MP because I desperately needed it to stay alive because I was pretty underleveled for the fight. And suddenly I felt like I was actually having a fluid motion between synergy attack, regular ability, synergy ability, heal, back to synergy attack, and it all felt like this awesome flow. That was the moment that I really understood the gameplay loop of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth in terms of the battle mechanics, and I gotta say, it's genius. The way that you have so many different tools to interact with any situation, and you have this great loop between your attacks and your abilities that will cycle through each other, it makes for such an amazing and replayable experience. This is a really long game, and if you are using the combat wisely, you will not be bored of it by the end. One thing that I was really worried about with Rebirth was the battle mechanics getting stale. We had already fought these remake battles for so many hours in the original game, and it looked like the battles were pretty similar in Rebirth. But surprisingly, the small additions of synergy attacks, synergy abilities, as well as the new characters, it's enough to get you all the way through Rebirth without ever really getting tired of the combat. It also helps that the boss fights are really epic and the side bosses are usually pretty gimmicky, so you always have to have some kind of setup going in that really changes things up. The difficulty curve of Rebirth is also really good. If you play the game on dynamic, it feels pretty smooth all the way through. But even on normal, I did a lot of side questing and the game felt pretty good challenge-wise all the way through. Then of course you have hard mode, which is pretty much just as good as it was in Remake. And then of course you have the brutal and legendary challenges at the end of everything that will really push you to your limit. There was a lot of discourse online as to whether or not the brutal and legendary challenges were too hard. I don't think they were too hard. And trust me, I know this sounds silly coming from a guy that plays Final Fantasy VII for a living, but trust me, I really struggled on the brutal and legendary challenges. But having said that, this is the finale to battle mechanics that have been built upon over 2 consecutive games. I feel like it's okay to have an ultra difficult challenge to challenge what you've learned over both games consecutively. I think the problem really lies with the Rulers of the Outer Worlds challenge, specifically the final fight with Sephiroth. The problem with this fight is that it's gimmicky, and it comes after 4 super long, difficult fights. So after all of that, you get to this gimmicky fight, you lose immediately because you don't understand the gimmick, and then you have to do all the long fights again. There was a big outcry to have some kind of way to practice the Sephiroth fight, so you don't need to go through all of the other boss fights every time you want to fight Sephiroth. And I agree, with how gimmicky he is, it would have helped to have some kind of practice mode. I think an easy solution to this would have been to make the player get through all the other fights once and get to Sephiroth, get blasted, and then have some kind of practice mode unlocked so you can learn the gimmick, and then you just need to get through all the boss fights one more time. Now, I know that a lot of people will say that in the general gaming landscape, punishing gameplay is pretty popular right now, and I would agree. But I guess people just weren't expecting it in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. The original game and remake don't really have any punishing scenarios like this, so it just kind of felt like it was out of left field. Not to mention, the game is extremely long, so going through everything else you need to do, and then getting to this challenge and realizing you're not going to be able to get through it in just an hour or two, led to a lot of frustration. Overall though, I think the battle mechanics are really fun and decently challenging throughout a regular playthrough, and then you have some super difficult post-game stuff, and that's what I love to see. Now let's talk about the exploration gameplay. I already gave the game a lot of props for having an open world and feel like that really fits with what the game needed, but how is the actual gameplay? Is it fun? Well, I gotta say, my first time through, I absolutely loved the exploration. It was so fun to just run in a straight line and do whatever it was I ran into. I saw some people complaining that some of the activities are a bit boring after doing them multiple times, specifically the Assassin's Creed-esque towers that you have to climb, but I gotta be honest, I was having fun the entire time. Even after I beat the game and I went back to fill out all of the intel, I had a blast just running around completing everything. Now, I do feel like part of this is just personal preference. Some people like to 100% open world games like this and do the same thing over and over again to see the percent go up. Other people, they just want to do it once or twice and then they get bored of it. But I think that there's a lot of mechanics in the game that help keep it fresh. For one thing, all of the areas feel really different. You have the grasslands, which is more of a simple area to explore. You have Gungaga, which has all of the really difficult areas to find and stupid mushrooms that send you into areas you don't want to be in. And you have Cosmo Canyon, where you can fly around on the Chocobo to get to areas. It doesn't feel like you're doing the same exact thing in every area. It feels like there is a bit of a difference depending on which area you're currently in. You also have the Proto-Relic missions, which are quite a bit different in each area, so that keeps things fresh as well. I think what I liked most about the open world areas was that I felt like I could explore as much as I wanted to, and as soon as I started to feel a little bored with it, which honestly I never did, but even if I did, I could just move on. There was nothing saying like I need to do this stuff now, or I didn't feel like I needed to hit some sort of power level to move on. It always felt like I could explore just as much as I felt like exploring, and then move on when I was ready. If you're somebody that likes to 100% stuff as soon as you get to it, you certainly could do that. Or if you're somebody that wants to just experience each activity once and then move on, you can do that too. It doesn't feel like you're pressured either way. Now let's talk about the mini games. Oh boy. I don't even know where to begin with the mini games. You could have told me that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth had half the mini games that it has, and I probably wouldn't have believed you until the game came out. It is absolutely absurd how many mini games are in this game and how different they are to each other, how well made they are. None of them feel copy and pasted. All of them feel like they fit within the paradigm of the area they're in. Most of these mini games are really fun, and if there's any mini game that you don't like, most of the time they don't really overstay their welcome. The big boy minigame is of course Queen's Blood, and I have heard so much praise for this. It really feels like they took a game that could have been a game on its own and inserted it into Rebirth. There is so much depth here, so many different cards, so many different ways to play, and even a little mini storyline that you get to play out throughout the game. I love the Yu-Gi-Oh!-esque story that they inserted into Queen's Blood. It just gives it so much more life as a game within the game. With all of the different emotions that Queen's Blood gives you, whether it just be playing random people in the game, the crazy cargo ship part, or the serious Yu-Gi-Oh! Story near the end, it feels like it could have been its own game. There is one more thing I'd like to mention about the minigames though, and it's kind of a weird one, and that's pacing. Now you would expect me to talk about pacing when it comes to story, but actually there's a really interesting pacing issue when it comes to the minigames when you get to Costa del Sol. The game does a pretty good job splitting gameplay elements so that you're doing a little bit of combat here, a little bit of linear story there, a little bit of mini games here, back to open world section here, now we're doing some more combat. But there's this really weird issue when you get to Junon. You fight Bottom Swell, or Terror of the Deep, and then you're thrown into this little gauntlet of mini games. You have to do the Mr. Dolphin thing, and then you have to do the whole Junon section with finding all the soldiers, and then you have to do the parade. And then you're thrown onto the cargo ship where you have to do a giant Queen's Blood tournament. And you do get to do a couple fights here, and you get to fight the Genova boss fight. But then you're thrown into Costa del Sol, which is like the ultimate marathon of minigames. Now I do want to say that I enjoyed all of these sections. The Junon section was amazing, the cargo ship was really fun, and Queen's Blood is really fun, and I enjoyed all of the minigames in Costa del Sol. But I gotta say that near the end of Costa del Sol, I was starting to get really burnt out with minigames. I really wanted to just get back to the open world exploration and play the game at my own pace, but I was being forced into this funnel of minigame after minigame. I talked to a lot of people in the community, and it feels like a lot of people felt the same way. And it even got to the point where people were getting so sick of the minigames that after Costa del Sol, it kind of ruined the experience of minigames from there on out. People got to the Gold Saucer, and instead of being excited for the minigames at Gold Saucer, they were more like, oh no, more minigames. Which is a big shame, because the Gold Saucer was one of the things that people were the most excited about. But it turns out that the entire game kind of feels like the Gold Saucer. So yeah, there was definitely a big pacing issue there. I feel like what they should have done is when you got to Costa del Sol, everything should have been like closed down for some reason. Like there was some renovations happening, and you were forced to just leave Costa del Sol and go into the open world area and Mount Coral for a little bit. and then for some reason you have to return to Costa del Sol and do the whole thing with Hojo and all the minigames. Of course, some people would complain that that's not the way it happened in the original game, but that's one of those changes where for the modern game to work, that change makes a lot of sense. The only time when the changes are frustrating is when it feels like they come out of left field for no reason, but that would have been a very specific change for a very specific goal that doesn't overwrite any of the themes or ideas of the original game, but just makes for a better gameplay experience overall. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. This is one of the greatest video game soundtracks of all time. It is not only one of the greatest soundtracks of all time, but it is probably the best implemented soundtrack of all time. The way that the score is implemented into this game is nothing short of a masterpiece. Every big moment of the game feels like it has a note that hits right at the right moment. The end of a scene is always topped off by the end of somebody's theme. There's so many different versions of every song in the game for every specific moment. I could go on and on about how crazy the soundtrack is in this game. There are so many versions of each character's theme just for the Gold Saucer alone. When you go on a date with a character, there are multiple versions of their theme mixed with the Gold Saucer theme that play out throughout the date. Every single area has its own theme and its own battle theme. A lot of the mini games have their own themes. A lot of the side quests have their own themes. A lot of the bosses have their own themes. The game's soundtrack is 7 discs, 8 if you get the special minigame disc, but that's not even all the songs because a lot of the songs are taken from Remake and repurposed for Rebirth. It is honestly just incredible all across the board. I don't know how Square Enix always does it, but somehow they always do it. They always just hit the mark when it comes to the soundtrack. There is one problem though. I don't know how this happened because, like I said, the implementation of the soundtrack is incredible throughout the entire game, but for some reason, the music in the cutscenes sometimes is way too loud. And when I say too loud, I genuinely mean you can barely hear the people talking in the cutscene because the music is so loud.
Let's go and grab a drink. Celebrate the birth of our great mercenary union.
Forget our deal already?
Come on, fellow merc. With my brains and your brawn, we can clean up.
What's even stranger is that they split the audio into 5 separate settings in the options menu. You have master volume, music volume, sound effects volume, speech volume, and song volume? Why are music volume and song volume 2 separate options? Well, this is basically their band-aid fix for the bad mixing by giving you a separate option to change the song volume in cutscenes in particular. Now, why they didn't name this setting cutscene song volume or something that's more obvious instead of music volume and song volume, I have no idea. But in any case, this is just a band-aid fix. If you lower this setting down to a low number, this just means that during the cutscenes with really loud music, it's going to sound normal, and in every other cutscene, it's going to sound too low. Alright, let's briefly talk about the new characters, and let's start with the worst one, Cid. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've come to the conclusion that this character is not Cid. During my playthrough, I was very nice about this Cid. I felt like really we're just kind of getting a glimpse at him, and we're really going to learn more about him in part 3, so it's not really a big deal, but the more I've thought about it, the more I feel like this is just not Cid. We just recently played through Cid's part of Final Fantasy VII again, and it really made me realize how different the original Cid is to this new Cid. The original Cid has this really great dichotomy to his character, where on one side he's just a get-it-done kind of guy. He's real down-to-earth, you know, got AK-47s laying around in his house and a car literally sitting in his house, and he just wants to get stuff done, doesn't want to do the extra checks, just wants to get stuff finished. And on the other hand, he's a man of science. And not just the fact that he creates airships and rockets and stuff, but he even has a moment inside the rocket ship where he talks about how science should be the thing to save the planet, and whatever they do should have the backing of science. He also, of course, has this real rough personality that is hard to get along with. He falls asleep when the rest of the party is talking about what they need to be doing. He's very brash and constantly fights with other characters, but he also takes charge when he needs to. Now, I know that this Cid in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is still cooking, and we can't really look at this Cid and come to any huge conclusions about him. But I will say this. I don't see any of that stuff in this Cid. He's just so nice and like willing to do whatever the party wants him to do, and doesn't feel like he has any of the qualities of the original Cid. Now, I will be talking later about some of the characters that also have a lot of differences from their original versions, but the differences make sense. I don't see the reason why Cid is so different here. We do have a little bit of a moment with Cid and Aerith where Cid talks about Aerith's mother, and it feels like maybe he's being extra nice to the party because of the connection he had to Aerith's mother. But that's really about it. Other than that, I don't understand why he's so different. Now, maybe in Rebirth, we see the reason. Maybe this is all a front, and as soon as we get to Rocket Town, he like explodes and becomes his old character again, and I would love to see that. But for now, I can't really give him points just for what could possibly be in the future. I feel like this version of Cid is just boring. Now, I don't feel like we've really gotten enough information about Vincent to really talk a lot about him. I did really like the Galleon Beast fight, and I'm curious to see if this Vincent is more like the Advent Children Dirge of Cerberus type Vincent, or if we're going to get something else entirely, kind of similar to what we're getting with Cid. Now let's talk about Red 13. Red 13 kind of lost a lot of the personality he had in Remake. There was a really great unknown aspect to him, and he felt like this all-knowing eye that was with the party and would jump in when need be to save us from what we don't know. In Rebirth, he's a dog. Like, he's just a dog. Like, he's the party's dog. They constantly crack jokes about him being a dog, which is funny because he's not a dog, but by the end of the game, I started to think that maybe he's a dog. He never breaks out of the shell of being a dog. There's never a moment where it's like, oh my god, he's actually not a dog. Like, he just continues to be a dog. He does have his moment in Cosmo Canyon, which is great, even though he does kind of still act like a dog there, but no, he does actually break away a little bit and becomes Red 13. But then after that, he just continues to be a dog. It doesn't change. They don't stop making the dog jokes. They just keep making the dog jokes. Then there's his voice change, which I have seen like a straight 50% split in the community. 50% of people like the voice change. 50% of people can't stand the voice change. I don't really know where I sit. I feel like it's really confusing. If he sounded all-knowing and mysterious during the beginning of the game, and then we got to Cosmo Canyon and we realized that he doesn't actually sound like that, and there was this big aha moment, but then after that he continued to be Red 13, then it would be fine. But it seems like after the voice change happens, he can't decide which version of himself he is. He constantly changes voices back and forth, and not just like side missions. It's not like you go on a side mission and he sounds one way and then you go back to the main story and he sounds another way. In the main story, he keeps changing voices. So I don't know if I'm supposed to look at this character as like a wise steward of the planet or a really young dog. Then when we get to the Temple of the Ancients, there's a super serious scene when we do his trial, and I just feel confused, like, am I supposed to take this character seriously or not? Either way, when Red 13 is good, he's really good, and the entire Cosmo Canyon section was amazing, minus the part where Gina Talk kind of ruins the Seto moment, but all of that together was really good. Now let's talk about Cait Sith. What an upgrade, man. I really love what we've done with Cait Sith. He is no longer this outcast character that doesn't really feel like he fits it all and tries to be funny but most of the time fails. He feels like a part of the party now, and he actually feels like comic relief. He's cute when he's supposed to be cute. He's funny when he's supposed to be funny. He actually helps push the story forward. He no longer feels like a throwaway character. His combat is also super unique and fits his character really, really well. And then there's Yuffie. Yuffie is by far the biggest upgrade, and it's not even close. They took a character that was practically a throwaway in the original game and made her one of the most interesting characters in the game. She was set up so perfectly in the DLC of Remake, and they took that setup and just ran with it. She's funny, she has all these super interesting character moments, she has all these different cool interactions with the other characters. She has a story that is continuing to develop over the course of the games without overwriting any of the other characters' stories. All of the side quests that have anything to do with Yuffie have really interesting dialogue, and she brings so much vibrancy and fun to the game. She was so one note in the original game, basically just, I need to save my hometown and I'm a thief that you can't really trust. In this game, she has so much character development, and she hasn't really had her moment yet. We haven't even gotten to Wutai, but even just the small things that they've placed around the game, you can feel how it's all building up to something great. Her dialogue in serious moments genuinely feel so emotional, but then you have silly moments like her singing on the couch. She feels like this real character, a real person that we can interact with. Aerith is supposed to be the spunky and witty one, and we see a lot of that in Remake. But in Rebirth, other than a few moments with Tifa, it feels like Yuffie's the one that's taken that role. Now, I don't have a lot to say about the returning characters. I think Barrett is pretty much just as good as he was in Remake. I think that Tifa has a lot of really awesome character development in this game, especially the crazy livestream scene. Cloud feels like he's coming along just the way he should. The only character I really want to talk about again is Aerith, and how she just really feels like she's fallen off. Aerith is probably the most important character in the game. In the original, she is the character that's in the most iconic scenes. She's the first thing you see in the game and the last thing you see in the game. She is the core of Final Fantasy VII. And in Rebirth, she just is kind of there. She has her girl moments with Tifa, and she has a little bit of dialogue with Cloud, but she doesn't really interact in any other way. She's just kind of there and kind of learning stuff in the background, and then she has some big story moments near the end. I don't have a ton to say about the graphics in this game. It is the same engine as Remake, and so it looks pretty much like Remake. The characters in particular look a bit worse than they did in Remake, but that makes sense. It's a much bigger game. You're in big open areas. The characters aren't going to be as detailed as they were in the more linear on-rails Remake. I will say that the texture issues that Remake had were not present at all in Rebirth. Everything looked really, really good from start to finish. The game can be played in either performance mode or graphics mode, and I have to say, on graphics mode, the game was completely unplayable for me. We talked about this at length in my Let's Play, and I'm not necessarily sure if it's just my setup or just me being used to 60 FPS games and playing games at high FPSs competitively, but whatever the case, graphics mode was genuinely impossible for me to play. It looked horrible. But performance mode looked great, and I had no issues with the game's looks all the way through. The only criticism I can give is the lighting. The lighting looks pretty good throughout the game, but there is a bug where sometimes the game will just get extremely dark, and you need to move the camera around until the lighting fixes itself. Alright, so this is a really interesting one. Let's talk about the content. Now, in today's world, we are used to games that come out halfway completed, or are only a couple hours long, or are missing giant chunks of the game that need to be added later. And one of the biggest things I loved about Remake was that it was just a game. It was just an 80-hour game from start to finish, no issues, nothing had to be added later. The game only got patched like once to fix one soft lock that some people had, but other than that, it was just a finished product. There were some pre-order bonuses that you could purchase later, and there was one DLC that was definitely worth the money, but other than that, there was no monetization to be had. It was just a full and complete physical product. I am happy to say that Rebirth is that and more. There's no microtransactions, there's nothing to purchase, you just buy the physical copy or the digital copy, and it is a full game from start to finish, and even bigger than Remake was. The game got, I believe, 2 updates, which just fixed little minor things in the background, but there was no issues on launch. The only thing that I can talk to is a few crashes that I got throughout the game, one of which was pretty bad. I crashed near the end of the Odin fight, which set me back the entire fight. But the other 2 crashes, there were autosaves right where I crashed, so those were no big deal. I talked to a lot of people in the community about their crashes, and everyone seemed to say that they had either 0 crashes or like 1 crash throughout the game, which for a AAA game in 2024 that got no updates and pretty much launched as is, that's pretty good. It cannot be understated how much content this game has for what you buy. I have seen so many games crash and burn over the last couple of years, whether it be because they launch unfinished or they launch in a state that they feel like they're going to add to it as the game goes on and they just don't, or, you know, name it. It's happened in the last couple of years. Remake was such a breath of fresh air to be able to just purchase it and play it all the way through. And Rebirth is the same exact thing. On top of that, Rebirth's content will keep you busy for upwards of 200 hours if you're really a completionist, and this is the same price that you paid for Modern Warfare 3's 3-hour campaign. Now, if you'll indulge me here for a second, I want to open up an interesting can of worms. I've talked to my community at length about this, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it. After playing through the entirety of Rebirth for over 200 hours and doing an entire Let's Play and making several guides for the game, it dawned on me that perhaps Rebirth could be one of the first games to be too long. Now, I know what you're going to say, and trust me, I've been down this same line of thinking. How could a game be too long? Like, if you pay $70 for a game, you just want it to be as long as possible. You just want to get as much bang for your buck as you possibly can. There is not a scenario where they could put too much into the game to where you would be upset about that. But let me challenge that line of thinking for a second. It took me about 200 hours to do everything that I wanted to do in the game, and granted, that was including content creation, but regardless, it's easy to see that I could have spent like 150 hours on this game even if I did it all casually offline. And because I was streaming the game about 9 hours a day, it took me about 2 months to do everything that I wanted to do. Now, back before I did this for a living, I probably played games about 2 or 3 hours a day. I would get off of work, I'd get a few hours to play, and then on to the next day. I've talked to a lot of people in my community that are in that current scenario, and they're still playing it now, trying to finish it because of how much there is to do and how little time they have to play. Now, you could see this as a positive thing. You paid $70 for a game that's going to last you like 5 or 6 months every day after work. That's a great bang for your buck. But in today's video game landscape, everyone has a ton of games that they want to play. Everyone has a huge backlog of games. There's always free games coming out. There's always new multiplayer experiences that people want to play with their friends. A lot of times you don't want to dedicate that much time to a single game. Now, again, you could argue that you can just play Rebirth as much as you want to play it, and as soon as that new multiplayer game comes out, you could put it down and go play that multiplayer game. No one's stopping you, no one's forcing you to 100% Rebirth before playing any other games. But I've talked to a lot of people that feel incomplete starting a game and then stopping it halfway through, and it may even make them feel a bit negative towards the game, like they couldn't put enough time into it to really see all of the themes and thoughts of the game fully develop. Going back to my example earlier about how I didn't really understand where the synergy attacks really fit into the gameplay loop until I got to the Bahamut fight. Well, let's think about someone that maybe only has an hour or two to play video games a day, and it takes them 3 months to finally get to that Bahamut fight. They're going to feel for 3 months that the synergy attacks and stuff don't really fit into the gameplay loop. And by the time they get there, are they really going to have that same click moment that I had? There's a lot of positives and negatives to having a game be really long. But my point is, are we getting to the point where games could be a bit too long for the general landscape of gaming? I've talked in the past before about games that maybe were a bit too long. For example, Elden Ring. One of my big issues with Elden Ring, and don't get me wrong, Elden Ring, great game, 10 out of 10, deserved to win Game of the Year. But if I had to pick an issue with Elden Ring, it would be that the world was so huge, but a lot of stuff felt samey. A lot of the dungeons felt kind of samey, and a lot of the bosses were repeated. And it felt like we could have removed that without really sacrificing much. So the question is, does Rebirth feel the same way? And I would argue no. I think that all of the content in Rebirth is so unique that you can play the game for 150 hours and not really do too much of the same stuff. Part of that is going to be playing through hard mode, which a lot of that is repeated content, but hearing all of that dialogue again and getting more out of it is definitely worth it, and the bosses are different enough on hard mode to give you a new challenge. But I cannot ignore that a big part of my audience has told me that they kind of got sick of the game by the end of it. They got to the final challenges, and especially given how difficult they are, felt like that they needed to take a break and just kind of put the game down after putting so many hours into it. So I simply posed the question because I know that Square Enix does listen to us on topics like these, and looking towards the third game, I do wonder if they took Rebirth and just added on top of it again and used, a lot of the same stuff but just made it even bigger. Are we getting to the point where the game would be so large that no one could reasonably get all the way through it without having to put it down? And a lot of that depends on the content. I think that me personally, Rebirth was like the perfect length. By the time I was getting sick of each individual thing, whether it be the combat or the mini games or the exploration, that's when I pretty much completed that thing and I was ready to move on to completing the next thing. But looking towards that third game, if it's going to be even longer than Rebirth, it's really going to depend on what that content is. If you're somebody out there that feels like more content is better no matter what, if you're paying $70 for a game, you want it to be as long as humanly possible, and you're totally willing to just drop it and pick it up at will when you need to, then let me ask you this question. If part 3 was 300 hours long, 100 hours of that was story, 100 hours of that was gameplay, and 100 hours of that was mini games, is that the type of game you would really want to stick through to the end? Would you be willing to sacrifice 6, 7, 8 months playing this game at 3 hours a day and not play any other video games so that you could finish it? Would you want to be completely blind to all the other games that are coming out, all the multiplayer games your friends are playing, all of the single player experiences that are coming out and are important to the industry right now, that people are talking about right now, because you're still finishing the third remake game? The point is, a game can't just be long, it needs to be constantly evolving. If the game's going to be 200 hours long, it needs to be constantly keeping us interested and be evolving in its gameplay, in its story, etc. It can't just be 100 more hours of the same thing. For me, I feel like Rebirth hit it pretty well. My only issue was how gimmicky that final super boss was. I was pretty sick of the game at that point and just wanted to be able to put it down for a little bit, but I was forced to try to learn this gimmicky boss, which took many hours of doing the same fights over and over again. And after already putting 200 hours into the game, I was pretty fed up with it. But before that moment, I did feel like the game was evolving enough to where I was still having new types of fun 180 hours in. But I think a lot of my community would disagree. A lot of people were saying that they had to put the game down at 100 hours. They had heard the story and they were just completing all of the objectives and side stuff that they wanted to do, and it wasn't grasping them enough to make them want to put another 100 hours in just yet. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is an amazing addition to the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, and an amazing game in its own right. The core thing that me and a lot of the Final Fantasy VII community wanted to see with this game was that feeling of adventure, that feeling of an open world, that feeling of leaving Midgar and hitting the world map. And I really feel like they nailed that. This game also feels separate enough from Remake. It's not just another remake, it is its own game entirely. It is well worth the price tag, with over 150 hours of pretty unique gameplay all throughout, and no monetization to speak of. It has some of the greatest sound and music implementation I have ever experienced in a video game, and a story that does a great job sticking to a lot of the themes and values of the original game, while also keeping it exciting for old fans. There are a lot of deep-cut references for those who are passionate about Final Fantasy VII, but it doesn't feel like a new player would be completely lost. I do feel like someone who has never played Remake Part 1 would be pretty overburdened with all the gameplay mechanics of Rebirth, but given that this is a sequel, I don't think that's a big issue. The game does have some flaws. There's some pacing issues with the amount of mini-games in a certain part of the game, there's some lighting issues, and one of the core aspects of the original game, the character of Aerith, feels a bit lost. The game is also so long that it might be difficult for people who don't have a lot of time to play to get through the main story aspects of the game, and the argument could be made that some of this extra content could have been shaved off in order to put more development time into the graphics, into the lighting, into character moments, or maybe even just more big bombastic cutscenes. Final Fantasy VII Remake felt like a step forward for action RPGs, especially action RPGs coming from Square Enix. And Final Fantasy VII Rebirth feels like a step forward for open world games, especially Square Enix open world games. Yes, it borrows some concepts from other open world games, but there's a lot of unique value to this as well. It is genuinely so fun to just explore the areas and see what you run into, whether it be little lore tidbits, new gameplay mechanics, new bosses to fight, or yet another minigame. The gameplay loop is fun and extremely deep. You can play this game for over 100 hours and still learn new mechanics that you can utilize in battle. The minigames, although not very replayable, are extremely varied and very fun your first time through. For every few minigames that you're not really into, there'll be another minigame that you really like. My biggest issue with the minigames is the lack of replayability with anything other than Queen's Blood. The whole idea of the Gold Saucer is to be a playground that you can go back to and play with whenever you want to break from the main game, but especially the minigames in the Gold Saucer are really just one and dones. Even the combat arena doesn't have the same replayability and randomness factor that the original battle arena had. Not to mention, the entire game just kind of feels like a Gold Saucer with how much it's constantly throwing games at you. But what the Gold Saucer lacks in its minigames, it makes up for in charm. It's one of the coolest areas of the game, and in general, I think all of the areas do an amazing job feeling like the original areas from the original game, but blown up times 100. As a remake, this game feels like it's doing justice to the original game, while also being interesting in its own ways. As a video game itself, it's very well paced, it's very entertaining, and it gives us a lot to look forward to in Part 3. In my original Final Fantasy VII Remake review, I gave the remake a 9 out of 10, but that wasn't really taking into consideration any other games, it was just kind of a number that I felt fit the game. If we're just taking Final Fantasy VII Rebirth versus Final Fantasy VII Remake, I do feel like Rebirth overall is a better game. There's more to do, there's more variety, it's a much bigger game, but I think the best thing about these two games is that neither one really overwrites the other. I've seen people say that it's hard to go back to Remake combat after playing Rebirth combat because it's so much smoother, and I will agree to that. But in terms of just the general gameplay of the games, they're very different, and I can definitely see enjoying each of them in their own vacuum. I do think that the presentation and the respect given to the original source material is even better in Rebirth than it was in Remake though. So if I had to give Rebirth a number, I would give it a 9.5. Who knows, maybe that means that Part 3 will be a 10 out of 10, but for now, I'm just happy we have two amazing games that both do their own justice in bringing Final Fantasy VII into the modern age. Now, of course, if you want my precise thoughts about specific parts of the game, you can check out my playlist of my Let's Play, but I just want to say now, thank you so much everyone who has been a part of this journey. Thanks to everyone who watched the Let's Play and was here live while I was playing the game, and thanks to everyone that continues to be part of my community and continues to talk about the game and its future. It has been such a blessing to play through these games with the community. Back when I started this channel 16 years ago, Final Fantasy VII was already a thing. We were more of reminiscing about the game we all played before we joined together. Now, we get to experience these games as a new product, talk about what's happening on screen and what's going to happen in the future, and I just do not want to take that for granted. It has been such an incredible experience to run through these games and talk about the good and the bad, and just experience Final Fantasy VII together and talk about why it's so special to us. And thanks again for watching this video, and I look forward to continuing to analyze and talk about this game with you guys while we wait for Part 3.